good faith to that oath that we all took. Thank you. I yield the floor.
President. Madam President.
Senator from Maine.
I see that the senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is on the floor. I would inquire through the chair how long she is seeking to speak. We are about to proceed to the consideration of the amendment that has been filed by Senator Portman and co-sponsored by Senator Ayotte, Senator Heller, and Senator McCain. And this is a rather complicated parliamentary situation, and then there's going to be a debate. If the senator from Massachusetts is going to speak very briefly, I would withhold. If she's going to speak at length, then since we have members on their way, I would proceed. So if we could inquire through the chair.
So I would tell the
Senator from Massachusetts.
Yes, I would tell the senior senator from Maine, my plan had been to speak for less than 10 minutes, but if that doesn't work, I certainly will yield to the senator from Maine and do what she requests or whatever she needs here.
Madam President.
Senator from Maine.
I would ask unanimous consent that the senator from Massachusetts be permitted to speak for no longer than 10 minutes. And if it were a little shorter than that, it would make the senator from Maine very happy.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
And I want to thank the senator from Maine, and I will do my very best. Madam President, I rise today to speak about the importance of passing the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, a bill that I'm proud to co-sponsor and to support. It has taken us far too long to arrive at this day. For nearly 40 years, members of Congress have worked to pass legislation that would protect LGBT Americans from discrimination in the workplace. Much has changed since Bella Abzug introduced the Equality Act of 1974. Equal marriage is now the law in 14 states. 21 states in the District of Columbia have enacted laws to protect against employment discrimination based on sexual orientation. And 16 states in the District of Columbia also protect against gender identity discrimination. The Supreme Court has rejected DOMA, a law that legalized discrimination against same-sex spouses, by calling that law exactly what it was, unconstitutional. In the private sector, a majority of Fortune 500 companies have adopted policies to protect workers from discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And polling data show that a majority of small businesses have similar policies in place. By nearly every measure, we have made progress in the long march toward equality. And yet, in the face of all this progress, nearly a half-century since Congress first enacted Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, prohibiting employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, we still have not extended these basic federal protections to LGBT Americans. Let's not mince words here. The failure to treat all our citizens with the same dignity is shameful. In America, equal means equal. Many have tried hard to reach this day, and our legislators from Massachusetts have long been leaders in this fight. Senator Ted Kennedy and Congressman Barney Frank both spent decades working on this issue. Senator Paul Tsongas from Massachusetts introduced the first Senate bill to prohibit employment discrimination against LGBT Americans all the way back in 1979. But progress has been slow. The last time the full Senate voted on ENDA was 17 years ago, when a version of the law championed by Senator Kennedy failed to pass by a single vote, 49 to 50, back in 1996. In 2007, the House passed a version of ENDA introduced by Congressman Frank, but the bill made no progress in the Senate. Today, there are 55 co-sponsors of INDA in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans representing the broad majority of support for the bill, signaling that tremendous progress has been made. It is all the more shameful that it has taken us this long to arrive at this day because Americans believe in equality. According to one survey, some 80% of Americans believe that it is already illegal to discriminate against workers based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Unfortunately, however, this is one of the rare instances where the American people are giving Congress way too much credit, because the truth is we haven't acted yet. And the consequences of congressional inaction remain all too real for millions of LGBT Americans. Despite the successful efforts in many states to pass non-discrimination measures, Americans living in over half the country can still be discriminated against in the workplace based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And it happens. Between 15 and 43% of LGBT Americans have reported experiencing discrimination or harassment in the workplace. A quarter of transgender Americans have reported being fired from a job due to their gender identity, and a whopping 90% reported experiencing harassment and mistreatment. There's been a lot of progress toward a more inclusive nation, but for LGBT workers, a law to stop employment discrimination can't come fast enough. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act pending in the Senate will protect LGBT individuals in the workplace, update the law to reflect what the vast majority of Americans already believe is the law, and help fulfill our constitutional responsibility to protect equality in this nation. INDA doesn't provide any special rights to any particular group of Americans. It does not compel any religious organization to change its views. It just creates a level playing field for LGBT workers. It makes sure that all workers are judged by the work they do, not by who they are or who they love. America's ready for this day. An overwhelming majority of voters, both Democrats and Republicans, support the enactment of this law. They know it reflects the values of our nation. And America's businesses are ready too. Recent polling shows that a large majority of small businesses support the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. As for big businesses, 88% of Fortune 500 companies have already implemented policies prohibiting discrimination against gays and lesbians in the workplace. Raytheon is one of the nation's top defense contractors, and a proud Massachusetts-based company bars LGBT discrimination. One executive at Raytheon is quoted as saying, "The organization's culture of inclusion absolutely gives us a recruiting edge when it comes to hiring the best and the brightest." Shortly before his death in March 2009, Senator Kennedy joined with Senators Merkley, Collins, and Snowe in what would be his final attempt to push bipartisan legislation over the finish line. At the time, Senator Kennedy eloquently explained his continuing support for INDA by noting that the promise of America will never be fulfilled as long as justice is denied to even one among us. Those words were true in 1974 when Bella Abzug introduced the Equality Act. Those words were true when the Senate came within one vote of passing INDA in 1996. Those words were true when Senator Kennedy offered them in 2009. And those words are true today. The promise of America will never be fulfilled so long as justice is denied to even one among us. We deal with a lot of different kinds of legislation in the Senate. This week we have a chance to vote on a law that is a measure of who we are as a people and what kind of world we want to build. I believe in a world where equal means equal, and that's why I will be voting to outlaw employment discrimination against my neighbors and my friends. Senator Kennedy, Senator Tsongas, and Congresswoman Abzug are no longer with us, but like so many others, they fought hard to get us here, to get us one step closer to equality for all of us. It has taken us far too long to arrive at this day, but we are here now, and we are not going back. Thank you, and I want to thank the senator from Maine for giving me this time.
I suggest the absence of a quorum, Madam President.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senate now in a quorum call, waiting for a senator to come to the floor to speak. Formal debate expected today on ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. That should get underway. We've had some general speeches on the topic already. That bill would ban employers from using sexual identity or gender orientation in hiring, promotion, and firing decisions. Several amendments are expected to be offered, including ones related to protections for religious employers. We could have some votes occurring during today's session as well. Again, a quorum call underway, waiting for a senator to come to the floor.
Madam
Senate is in a quorum call.
Madam President, I would request unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate resume consideration of Senate Bill 815 and the pending Portman Amendment, that the Toomey second-degree amendment be withdrawn, that the Senate proceed to a vote on the Portman Amendment, that upon disposition of the Portman Amendment, the previously withdrawn Toomey Amendment be made pending, as a first-degree amendment to the committee-reported substitute, that a Reed second-degree amendment to the Toomey amendment, which is at the desk, be made pending, and following the reporting of the Reed second-degree amendment, the Senate resume the motion to proceed to calendar number 236, H.R. 3204, with all of the above occurring with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection. Under the previous order, S15 is now pending, and Amendment 2013 is withdrawn. S815 is pending, and Amendment 2013 is withdrawn. The question now occurs on Amendment number 2012. Is there no further debate? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. And the amendment is agreed to. Under the previous order, the Toomey amendment is now pending.
Madam President, I call up the Reed Amendment number 2020.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Maine, Ms. Collins, for Mr. Reed, proposes an amendment number 2020 to amendment number 2013.
Madam President, I ask for the yeas and nays on the Reed Amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The yeas and nays are so ordered. Under the previous order, Senate resumes consideration of the motion to proceed of H.R. 3204.
Madam President.
Senator from Maine.
Madam President, that was an extremely complicated parliamentary request, and perhaps it would be helpful to my colleagues if I gave a little bit of explanation of what just occurred. The good news, in my judgment, is that the Senate has adopted by voice vote an amendment proposed by Senators Portman, Ayotte, Heller, Hatch, and McCain. I very much appreciate their willingness to work with the co-sponsors and sponsors of this legislation. Many of the sponsors of this amendment are tied up in hearings, but I expect them to be coming to the floor very shortly to debate this amendment after the fact. But let me just explain a little bit about what the Portman, Ayotte, Heller, Hatch, McCain amendment does. The underlying bill, ENDA, includes a pretty broad exemption for religious organizations based on current law in Title VII. What the Portman et al. Amendment does is it ensures that federal, state, and local government agencies will not be able to discriminate against these exempt organizations. For example, the amendment would be denied grants or contracts for which they would otherwise qualify from government agencies. It also protects them from discrimination by government agencies from participating in government-sponsored activities. So I believe that this amendment improves the bill. It ensures that these organizations, these religious-based organizations that are exempt under ENDA, cannot be subtly penalized for having that exemption by being denied grants, contracts, other licenses, fees, whatever, that they would otherwise be entitled to just solely based on the fact they are exempt under ENDA. So I want to commend Senator Portman, Senator Ayotte, Senator Heller, Senator Hatch, and Senator McCain for making sure that these important protections are in place, and that if an organization has a legitimate exemption under this bill, that the federal government or state government cannot discriminate against that organization that is legitimately claiming an exemption under ENDA. So I believe this amendment improves the bill and provides a significant protection for exempt religious organizations, and I'm very pleased that it was accepted by a voice vote. Now, I know that Senator Portman and Senator Ayotte are on their way and want to speak on the amendment we've just adopted. Let me explain the second part of the very complicated parliamentary action that we just took. At least I will attempt to. What it does is preserve Senator Toomey's right to get a vote on his amendment. It's my understanding that that vote will require 60 votes of the Senate in order to be approved, but it essentially guarantees that he is next up, he's next in line for a vote. So his amendment will be the pending amendment. Again, I know this was a complicated process. I want to thank the chair, the president presiding over the Senate, and I want to thank the floor staff on both sides of the aisle, Senator Reed's staff and Senator McConnell's staff, in making sure that we protected everybody's rights in this debate. And I think that's very important when we're talking about a bill as significant as ENDA. Madam President, I know, as I said, that some of the sponsors are on their way, but since they've yet to reach the floor, rather than filibuster the successful conclusion of the Portman Amendment, I will suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
We continue to wait for a senator to come to the floor in a quorum call now in the U.S. Senate, live here on C-SPAN 2. Senate today working on ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, consideration of that getting underway today. That legislation would ban employers from using sexual identity or gender orientation in hiring, promotion, and firing decisions. Votes may happen during today's session. Our live coverage continues here on C-SPAN. C-SPAN 2, that is. Over on C-SPAN, live right now, the Senate Finance Committee is hearing from Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius on the rollout of the nation's health care law and problems with the website healthcare.gov. Again, that coverage live now on C-SPAN. That will also re-air tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN. Here we're in a quorum call. We continue to wait for a senator to come to the floor.
Madam President, I rise today. First of all, I want to thank Senator Susan Collins.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
May the quorum call please be vitiated.
Without objection. The senator from New Hampshire is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, first of all, I want to rise today to thank my colleagues. And first of all, I'd like to thank my colleague from Maine, the senior senator from Maine, Senator Susan Collins, for the important work that she's been doing on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And I would also like to thank my colleagues for supporting an amendment that was brought forward recently and passed by this body, the Portman, Ayotte, Heller, Hatch, McCain amendment to strengthen the protections within the Employment Non-Discrimination Act for religious institutions. I firmly believe that people should be judged based upon the quality of their work. Discrimination has no place in the workplace. In my home state of New Hampshire, we have a long bipartisan tradition of working to advance common sense policies, and New Hampshire already has in place a state law preventing discrimination based on sexual orientation. I appreciate that the Employment Non-Discrimination Act is legislation that is important in terms of who we are, our values, making sure that people are only judged based on the quality of work in the workplace. I also appreciate that the legislation on the floor right now includes important protections for religious institutions. I have long been a strong supporter of the rights of conscience, of the rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution to religious freedom, and so these protections are very important within this bill. And I was pleased to work with members on both sides of the aisle to strengthen those protections by passing an amendment that will help ensure that religious organizations cannot be retaliated against for exercising their religious freedoms. Specifically, the Portman-Ayotte Amendment affirms the critical importance of protecting religious freedom in the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. It ensures that government cannot penalize a religious employer because it qualifies as exempt from non-discrimination requirements of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. The amendment protects religious institutions from adverse actions by the government on the basis of adhering to its religious tenets. In practical terms, the government may not use activities protected by the religious exemption as a basis to deny a religious employer a government grant or tax-exempt status or any other benefit that may be conferred by the government. I want to thank my colleagues for passing this amendment, which will strengthen the protections for religious institutions within the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and I thank you, Madam President, for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
The senator from Maine.
Thank you, Madam President. I again want to commend the senator from New Hampshire, Senator Ayotte, for her excellent work on this amendment. As I indicated earlier, I think the Portman-Ayotte amendment, which is co-sponsored by several other colleagues as well, it provides a very important protection against retaliation for those religious organizations that are legitimately exempted under ENDA. I also salute them for broadening the purposes section of the bill to recognize not only the need to address the widespread pattern of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, but also they've added a new subsection to recognize that another purpose is to help strengthen civil society and preserve institutional pluralism by providing reasonable accommodations for religious freedom. And I think both those changes strengthen the bill, and I want to commend the senator for her leadership on this issue. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President,
The senator from Maine.
I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
So the Senate back in another quorum call. We're waiting for a senator to come to the floor and speak. Our live coverage continues here on C-SPAN 2. Formal debate on ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, gets underway today. That bill to ban employers from using sexual identity or gender orientation in hiring, promotion, and firing decisions. Several amendments expected to be offered, including ones related to protections for religious employers. Votes could happen on amendments today. We expect final passage on the bill later this week, and our live coverage continues here on C-SPAN 2. Meanwhile, on C-SPAN right now, the Senate Finance Committee is taking testimony from Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius on the rollout of the nation's health care law and problems with the healthcare.gov website. Again, that's live right now on C-SPAN and will re-air tonight at 8 Eastern, also on C-SPAN. Here on C-SPAN 2, waiting for a senator to come to the floor.
Madam President,
The senator from California.
what is the parliamentary situation?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. I've come to the floor to just give my views on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, better known as ENDA, because this is essentially a bill with a long history. And it means a great deal to me personally because of work that I did in the city and county of San Francisco a long, long time ago. Actually, over 40 years ago, 1978, I was a brand new president of the Board of Supervisors. Actually, it was my third term as president. That's not quite right. When an ordinance to prohibit discrimination in both housing and unemployment on the basis of sexual orientation was actually passed by the board, I think it was a vote of 10-1. It was the first such legislation introduced in a major city anywhere in the United States. It was difficult to pass. There was a long debate. I look back on the press, it was a 2-hour debate, but it did pass back in 1978. And it's true, I at the time had some concerns, and so I watched the legislation implemented over the last 4 decades. It has protected people's jobs and livelihoods from unfair treatment. It's been a good thing for people and for business. I had some concerns. Would there be a lot of objections? Well, actually, in the time I was a supervisor and in the 9 years I was mayor, there were no objections. And all of a sudden, the city really came to see what equality meant. I know then, and I know now, that this legislation is the right thing to do. And it's not going to result in inappropriate behavior in the workplace or any of the other hobgoblins that the legislation's opponents raise. In 1996, ENDA came to this floor. An up or down vote on this bill was negotiated the same day the Defense of Marriage Act, or what we call DOMA, would have such a vote. These votes happened on December 10th, 1996. The Defense of Marriage bill passed. I was one of 14 senators to oppose it. 85 of my colleagues supported it, and President Clinton signed it into law. And as we all know now, what it essentially did was say that any gay couple that was legally married could not access more than 1,100 federal rights that were accorded to married couples. And now some 14 states have legalized gay marriage, and just recently it looks like Illinois is on its way to doing the same thing. ENDA failed by a single vote back then. That was a vote of 49 to 50. Today, things are very different, but there's still a long way to go. In an historic decision in June, the Supreme Court struck down the core piece of the Defense of Marriage Act. But DOMA is not yet fully repealed, and repealing it remains necessary. So in my view, the Defense of Marriage Act must and will be one day repealed for all. And although legislation like ENDA has been adopted in numerous states, there is still no federal end of discrimination. That means that most gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals are without critical protections against employment discrimination. In fact, most people, over 56% of the population, live in the 29 states that have not enacted employment protections against gays and lesbians. Over 66% of people live in 34 states that have not enacted such protections for transgender individuals. And there is no question discrimination in the workplace against these groups remains a big problem. Let me give you just a few examples. There's the case of Mia Macy, a case in which the Justice Department found that Ms. Macy's transgender status played an impermissible role in the hiring process. She had for 12 years been a police detective in Phoenix, Arizona. She was a veteran. She applied for an open position in an ATF ballistics lab to do ballistics imagery work she was certified to do. She was told she could have the position subject to a background check. Then Macy revealed her transgender status to the government contractor staffing these positions. Her background check was ordered stopped by ATF soon thereafter. She received an email stating the position was no longer available because of funding cuts, even though there was no evidence that was the case. It turns out that the number of positions available had hastily been cut from 2 to 1, and the person hired for that one position lacked much of the experience Macy had. Macy was, according to DOJ's decision, quote, very likely better qualified, end quote, than the individual actually hired for that position. So this is wrong. Ballistics matching can be the difference between a shooter in jail and a shooter who might kill again walking the streets of our neighborhoods. The person who is actually hired should be the person who can do the best job, period, regardless of whether the person is gay, straight, or transgender. Another case involves a police officer from the city of St. Cloud, Minnesota. According to a court opinion, the officer was an, quote, excellent, end quote, officer. He was consistently awarded marks as excellent or competent on his performance reports. The officer got letters of recognition and commendation for his accomplishments, including his work on the Community Crime Impact Team, his work against drunk driving, his performance in apprehending a sexual assault suspect, and for his work in recovering a stolen vehicle. Then he came out as gay. After that, according to the officer, he almost immediately, quote, was subject to increased scrutiny, increased disciplinary measures, excessively through documentation and surreptitiously recorded interventions, end quote, as well as, quote, multiple internal investigations, end quote, and removal from assignments. The federal court found that the almost immediate shift in the treatment of this officer, quote, supports an inference of unlawful discrimination, end quote, under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which applies to state and local agencies. But if a private employer had discriminated like this, there likely would have been no federal protection. In a case out of Oregon, an individual who ran a production line for battery separators was subjected to harassment on the job. He was called Tinkerbell and, quote, a worthless queer, end quote. He was described as using phrases that I simply will not say on the Senate floor because they're graphic and beyond the pale. I think they would shock many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. This harassment occurred on a daily basis, sometimes in the presence of a supervisor. Then 2 days after reporting the harassment to Human Resources, the individual was fired. In this case, the federal court found the evidence credible enough to warrant a trial under Oregon law. So sometimes discrimination is not as clear as it is in these cases. And I'm going to quote from a 93-year-old constituent of mine who called my office urging full support for this bill. And this is what he said, quote, I don't usually take the time to call my senator, but this is important to me. I've lived in San Francisco almost my whole life, and at 93 years old, I've seen a lot. Even in a liberal state like California, as a gay man, I never felt equal to my colleagues, end quote. I used to work at this is a quote too, I used to work at a bank, and I kept working until I was 79 to earn my retirement. I was afraid to bring my husband to company parties. I never wanted to seem too flamboyant to my supervisors. It seems too ridiculous when I think back on it, but people don't understand that this kind of discrimination is subtle. It broke my heart when I watched the Senate fall one vote shy of passing ENDA back in the 90s. I hope the senator remembers what it used to be like and fights to pass ENDA today. Well, I do remember, and I do know that this bill will help stop discrimination in the workplace. The bill is simple. It says a person cannot be denied employment because of who that person is, gay, straight, or transgender. The bill provides no special privilege. No special privilege. It creates no quota. It creates no exemption from the codes of conduct or anything else. It does not allow inappropriate conduct in the workplace. In fact, the bill is narrower than Title VII protections in certain respects. In my view, the bill does provide critical employment protections, and it's long past the time that it be signed into law. 3 years ago, we recognized that a person's merit, not sexual orientation, is what matters for service in the military. The point is no different in this bill. If a person wants to be a ballistics expert, a police officer, a firefighter, a bank teller, a lawyer, a factory worker, or anything else, the question should simply be, can the person do the job? People have families, they have spouses, they have children, they need to put food on the table, they have college expenses for their children, student loans to pay, and unforeseen medical expenses. They may have elderly parents that they care for and who need their assistance. All of this requires a job. Should a person be denied that basic aspect of life, should a person's spouse or children or parents be hurt simply because that person is gay or straight or transgender? For me, the answer is simple. It's no. Now, that person should not engage in any conduct that would be unseemly for a heterosexual couple. The conduct laws are also important. So if this legislation is enacted, which I hope very much will happen, that will be the law of the land, and it will be long overdue. So I just wanted to come to the floor and indicate some of the past and go back to the 45 years ago when the first employment bill that would prohibit discrimination was enacted, and I'm very proud to have been a vote for it then. So thank you very much, Madam President. I yield. Thank you.
The senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I rise today to thank my colleagues for their support earlier today of an amendment that I offered strengthening the protections for religious liberty in the ENDA legislation, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. This amendment was co-sponsored by Senators Ayotte, Heller, Hatch, and McCain, and I want to especially thank Senator Collins for the key role she played in its passage. Madam President, I firmly believe that no one should be subject to unjust discrimination. So I support the basic premise of ENDA, which is that people should be judged by their experience, their qualifications, and their job performance, not by their sexual orientation. Bottom line is people shouldn't be able to be fired just because they're gay. I believe the legislation currently before this body will help create that level playing field and ensure that employment opportunities are available to all. But it doesn't mean it's a perfect bill. It should be improved. And my amendment seeks to ensure that this legislation designed to promote tolerance of one kind doesn't enshrine intolerance of another kind. Religious liberty is an important part of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act already. The underlying bill includes a significant exemption for religious employers. But we've got to make certain that in pursuit of enforcing non-discrimination, those religious employers are not subject to a different kind of discrimination, and that would be government retaliation. My amendment seeks to ensure that the government cannot penalize a religious employer because it qualifies as exempt from the non-discrimination requirements of ENDA. It protects, for instance, a church or religious charity or religious school from adverse action by the government on the basis of adhering to its religious tenets in a manner that would otherwise be unlawful under ENDA. In practical terms, this means that the government can't use activities protected by ENDA's religious exemption as a basis to deny religious employers government grants, contracts, tax-exempt status, or other benefit. So my amendment prohibits the government from punishing a religious institution for adhering to its deeply held beliefs, and thereby seeks to keep the state from interfering in matters of faith. It does something else important, too. The underlying bill specifies several broad purposes related to addressing employment discrimination. My amendment adds to this introductory section an explicit reference to the fundamental right of religious freedom. It establishes as a basic purpose of ENDA that workplace fairness must be balanced against and made consistent with religious liberty. Now, I believe the principles of religious liberty and non-discrimination go hand in hand. When we think about non-discrimination, many of us think of the great civil rights movements of the 20th century. But as we know, the fight for tolerance goes back further than that, really to the very foundation of our republic. On my mom's side, some of my ancestors were Quakers. They came to this country, like so many before them, in search of religious freedom. At first, that was something hard to find in this country. When they arrived, members of this new sect were often persecuted. Their views and practices were viewed to be unorthodox, even strange. Sometimes they were imprisoned. Their books were burned. Some of the colonies didn't want them inside their borders. They knew a little bit about religious freedom, and they certainly knew something about discrimination. And it was their experience, and the experience of so many other groups of different faiths, that made freedom of conscience a cornerstone of our founding documents. The First Amendment begins, and I quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote. Religious freedom, therefore, is our first freedom, and the amendment that protects it really is our first non-discrimination law. Any law that we pass that seeks to prevent discrimination won't succeed if it doesn't, at the same time, protect religious liberty. The religious liberty protections in ENDA aren't perfect. My amendment makes them better, and that's why I appreciate my colleagues giving this amendment the support it deserves. Madam President, I'm looking forward to the passage of this legislation with this amendment. And again, I appreciate the work of the Senator from Maine and others on this. I yield back my time.
Madam President.
The senator from Maine.
Madam President, I rise to commend the senator from Ohio for bringing forth this very worthwhile